All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my application task number one. My name is Jimmy, and I'm beaming to you from Western Norway. The book that I have been working with this term is called CLIL Essentials for Secondary School Teachers. The book that I read is by Peeter Mehisto and Y.L. Teresa Ting. I found it ultimately to be a really valuable resource, and I'm going to share some pieces of it with you today. To start with, here are the standards that we are working with. First of all, 1A, candidates demonstrate knowledge of language structures in different discourse contexts to promote acquisition of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And 1D, candidates apply knowledge of English, academic language functions, learning domains, discipline-specific language, and discourse structures and vocabulary to promote EL's acquisition of multiple and diverse literacies. Now, before we move on from these, I know I've been very guilty sometimes of kind of reading past these standards. I wanted to pick them apart together with you a little bit. I think we can also, as teachers, benefit from deconstructing some academic language. So here we go. The first thing that jumps out to me is the language structures. What language structures are we going to be talking about? Today, we'll be talking about elements that are part of vocabulary, but also looking bigger, looking at phrases, and talking a little bit about genres, so different levels of language structures. I also wanted to hit on this different discourse contexts, which I'm taking to mean today various specific academic disciplines that our students are finding themselves engaging with. Down here in 1D, there are some more really interesting terms. Academic language functions is something that we've talked about some, I think back in week one, talking about SFL. We talked about some of these language functions, comparison, interpretation, prioritizing, etc. We'll be talking about some of those today. And then learning domains. This was actually a tricky one for me. I wasn't quite sure what was meant. So in the book, Mehisto and Ting talk about these domains as the affective, cognitive, and metacognitive. But I've also seen Ginny reference them as this is our listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So we'll just say that it's both, and we'll be addressing some of these. Discipline specific, again, shows up in 1D. And then this one, language and discourse structures and vocabulary. This is a big term that I'm kind of picking apart to look at all of these things. So words, collocations, phrases, terminology, language functions, and genres. Finally, this is maybe the most important idea here today. The fact that what we're doing when we talk about academic language is we're in these diverse disciplines, we're really talking about a group of interrelated, yes, but ultimately distinguishable languages, academic languages. And that's something that I'm hoping to pick apart and explore more today. Let's start with kind of an overview of the landscape. What is CLIL? It stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. And I want to start by actually contrasting this a little bit with the immersion education that I think a lot of us are doing really in international schools. CLIL is Mehisto and Ting really talk about how this is really a two-language education system where you've got students who are having or learning some of their subjects in the L1 and some of their subjects in the L2. I think what this means for that context, for the CLIL context, is that there's more of a division between the languages, and definitely there's crossover, and the book talks a lot about how you'll use L1 in L2 subjects and vice versa. However, unlike our immersion education, in CLIL, it seems like they don't necessarily have to be as intentional about making sure we're making space for mother tongue learning opportunities. Whereas in immersion, we have to be really careful that we're not creating a context where students' home languages are not valued. Whether you're CLIL or immersion, I think that the resounding kind of centerpiece of both is this idea that students are going to learn best when content and language are taught together, not as separate pieces. And this idea, to me, sounds pretty familiar based on what we've been doing so far in our course. Thinking about the teaching and learning cycle that really blends the teaching of language elements with that building of the field and content. And also it made me think of later on in our course, we talked about language learning through authentic communicative experiences when we were talking about different SLA models. Let's think about what we already know, because we actually already know quite a bit about this topic. I think in our course we've already seen and established the belief that academic language has to be explicitly taught, and that was definitely a foundational point in CLIL Essentials. This is really important because it increases access to the curriculum for all of our students, and this leads to the lowering of structural inequalities among students, making a more socially just learning environment and world as more people are able to access the curriculum. It's also really important that when we're teaching content in the L2, that we're explicitly linking language instruction into that. And this comes to the idea that I remember Jenny mentioning of immersion as opposed to submersion. That drawing attention to that academic language is how we make sure that our students are able to swim and make their way down the river of knowledge. We also, as a group, we've already developed a lot of knowledge about academic language. We know, and these are notes that I took from Ginny's introduction to academic language back near the start of the course, but we already know that academic language has a higher proportion of general academic vocabulary and domain-specific vocabulary. We also know that it tends to have more complex grammatical structures, including subordinating conjunctions. Expanded noun phrases and nominalizations are common. So expanded noun phrases that, as we were learning about last week with syntax, how you can have all of these pieces put into a noun phrase, and we see a lot of that in academic language. But then these nominalizations where you've got one big concept, one word that actually encompasses a whole process, and I've got urbanization here from geography and inflection maybe from foreign language study. And we've also got in academic language long stretches of tightly organized discourse. And we've also talked a little bit about how there are some differences between the academic language of different content areas. So learning about different text types, a lab report as opposed to a literary analysis essay, and what that means in terms of the language used. And we've talked a little bit about discipline-specific vocabulary. But I think there's a problem. I think there's at least to me, I feel like there's a gap in what we know. That I'm hoping to help us fill in, and that is twofold. So I'm going to put two questions up here on the screen, and I'd like you to pause the video for a moment if you're up for engaging, and I hope you are today. But so these two questions, please take a moment to just think about What ideas do you have? Are these things that you wonder or no? And these are, what language do we teach when we're doing trying to do academic language instruction? What elements really need to be taught? What are the most important, and how do we know what they are? And then, how do we actually go about teaching it in a practical sense? You can pause your video now and think, or even write something down. Now I'm assuming you've done that, and we're back. I've got a few solutions for you, or rather, Mehisto and Ting have some solutions for you. I'm going to present 3, but then I'm going to go off and explore kind of all of them at the same time. So this is, pardon my kind of strange organization, but I think looking at this holistically is going to be most effective. We're going to talk about how we can deepen our own understanding of academic language so that we can address it at various levels. We're also going to look at how to explicitly link content and language teaching, and the idea that ultimately it's the content that's going to drive the language that is being learned. Finally, we're going to talk just a little bit about the collaboration between content and language teachers. So let's go back into academic language. Broadly speaking, academic language is the language needed for learning, and Mehisto and Ting kind of expand on that to identify there are 3 kind of big elements. There's the idea that the students need to have the language to understand the teacher and learning materials. They also need to have the language that they need to interact with fellow students, and this is an interesting place where actually some social language comes into the academic domain. Finally, they need the language to be able to apply and demonstrate their learning. The book is full of these kind of conceptual maps, which when I first looked at this, I don't know what this is. This is large and confusing. But I'll just kind of break down a few interesting elements of this diagram, which I think actually ended up, once I took the time to understand it, actually ended up being really useful. The idea is that where we're headed with academic language is something called an academic narrative. That is to say that we're looking to help our students tell the story of what they're learning, making connections rather than just memorizing facts. And this is all about critical thinking, is constructing these academic narratives. There are 3 big ways that we get there. One is at the most macro level, when we look at texts and we say, okay, first, what's the purpose of the text that we're reading? How does that purpose result in us using different genres or text types? And then we can break those text types down into how they work in terms of tone, what their structure or organization is, and density, that is, how much information is being packed into a small amount of space. And that is one way we can think about constructing an academic narrative. Another way is maybe kind of the more middle level, thinking about the language of learning and the language for learning. So the language of learning, Mehisto and Ting say, is what we've been really talking about so far in our course as academic language, the language found in academic texts. But the language for learning is the language that students need to navigate in the classroom, to interact with the teacher and with their peers. Within both of these languages, we have common language functions, which we've mentioned. We've got registers, so groups of, so clusters of language that are used for in particular contexts, which helps us construct academic narratives. Finally, we've got the micro level. We can look at the words of academic language, terminology, collocations, figurative expressions, and grammatical conventions. There are some principles that Mehisto and Ting give us for thinking about teaching academic language. These are really helpful. I'm not going to read through them for you right now, but I encourage you to pause the video and give these a read. They're excellent, excellent ideas. But we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive. So I want to show you how this book really helped me complicate my understanding of vocabulary, and I think this is important academic language knowledge for all of us. We've got some words up here. Analyze, solid, in the style of, ooh, it's a phrase, colloquial, lost in the weeds, which is what Ginny's instructions said I was not supposed to do in this presentation. We'll see how successful I am. Differentiate, a high-protein diet. No. If we look at these, you know, they're all lexical elements, but we can make some divisions. Hey, why don't you pause the video again for a moment and see if you can think about how do you think you would categorize these different words? Okay, I hope you paused. And I hope you did some thinking about categories. I'm going to share with you how Mehisto and Ting kind of helped me think about this. At the base level is words. Now, I was actually really surprised that the word "word" was used in this way, but Mehisto and Ting really wanted to make the point that, you know, some things are really less complicated than we might think. They don't necessarily need as much attention as some other types of words. The word colloquial, even though it's a difficult word, it doesn't necessarily carry with it a huge amount of conceptual requirement. There's some, but not as much. One thing we can think about with words like colloquial is their word family. How do colloquial, colloquially, and colloquialism differ? Kind of the next level up of complexity are the language functions. So these are words that denote a particular task within a language, and these are often really important words for our students to know for being able to answer test questions. When a test question asks them to identify or discuss or analyze or differentiate, they can call on specific language to do that. A collocation is a helpful way of thinking about language. These are common phrases that show up in a particular discipline. I chose "in the style of" as something that might be a collocation in visual arts, for example. Figurative expression. So "lost in the weeds" carries more than just the literal meaning. In fact, it has nothing to do with weeds. And these are phrases and expressions that we need to make sure to explain to our students or draw their attention to help them figure out. And finally, terminology. Terminology is really interesting, and in fact, before I read this book, I would not have made a distinction between terminology and let's say words, or the language functions. But Mehisto and Ting actually made a really great distinction that I think is really helpful. So let's pick this apart a little bit more. When we've got a word like analyze, and I know I was using analyze as a language function on the previous slide, but in this case it actually functions really fine as a word. So with the word analyze, it's important that we help our students find a definition or a translation. It's important that we show our students examples of how this word is used in different contexts so that they can notice it and notice the subtleties of how it's used. And we can recognize word families here. So analyze, analysis, analytical, analytically. And these are great ways to teach this kind of vocabulary. But this is not enough for terminology. Take a look at this term, a high-protein diet. Now, I chose this term for a couple reasons. First of all, it's not something that people would necessarily expect to be a part of terminology because the words are actually fairly simple. And it's also more than one word. And I think we sometimes think of terminology as just one word. Actually, it can be phrases as well. Here's what's special about terminology. In addition to the fact that it can be a single word, a compound word, or a phrase, terminology requires more knowledge in order to understand. In fact, in order to understand a piece of terminology, we have to understand other concepts first that we then assemble or connect to this term. The idea here is that a translation is often not enough. We can, if we're looking at a piece of terminology like deforestation, if we translate that into the student's L1, that may not actually tell them anything. We need to instead help students build knowledge of how concepts relate to one another, and talk about the language that we use to explain that relationship. Now, all of this mucking around in the weeds brings us to this, back to our big question, is how do we know what academic language we need to teach? We know that students have, there's a huge amount of vocabulary, there's a huge amount of terminology. How do we decide what needs to be taught? Let's think about it this way. We know our students need to access content, and then they need to express content or knowledge. And we might start with a question like this. In this unit that I am planning, what texts will students listen to, read, produce orally, so speak, and write? And in our ideal world, where we have all the time to plan that is really ideal, we would amass a number of examples of these texts. The reading ones and the listening ones might be easy. We can find the resources. We can plan our any short lectures that we might give. We may need to call on past student work to find examples of these. We may even need to write exemplars ourselves. But here's what we do: is we take all of those texts, and then we ask the question, what language features are required to access the content? And the way we do that is by analyzing these texts. So we look at all of the texts that students are going to be asked to access and produce, and we look at the key language features in them. And we look at that in comparison to the language features that students are already able to use. From there, we actually can formulate some really specific language learning outcomes. So for each feature that shows up in the text, we've got a language learning outcome that we can then teach. And then the final question is, how can these language features best be taught? And we can design and implement content-rich language learning activities for these outcomes. Now, I want to recognize, and I'm feeling this myself, that this is a huge amount of, this takes a huge amount of planning to do well. And this is something that but if we can commit to this, it's going to have a really important impact on our students' language development. Let's see this in action, okay? So I'm going to take us through some of the analysis of the language, how I would analyze a text like this. This is a short example from an Environmental Systems and Societies textbook that one of my ELL students is currently working with and is having a really difficult time with. So I looked at this text and I pulled out a number of language features that I think are important to pay attention to. First one is this: the differences in insolation and temperature found from the equator to higher, more northern latitudes. This is one of these expanded noun phrases. So it's got multiple prepositional phrases in it. It's also got a participle phrase that's tacked on there. This is something that a student could easily get tripped up by. There's another expanded noun phrase in here. Here it is down at the end, and it's got a relative clause in it rather than a participle phrase. But that's not the only thing that's in here. We've also got some general academic vocabulary, so the tier 2. And I've highlighted some of these. So first of all, some places, place words that might also be found in a subject like geography. Some much more general academic terms, but terms that, sorry, I shouldn't use the word term, but some words that are going to be useful in different ways in different subjects. So a distribution in science might be different than a distribution of data in math, for example. The word model is also a common general piece of academic vocabulary. And then figure here. So this goes into knowing how to read textbooks and the genre that includes visuals. We've also got terminology, domain-specific vocabulary, tier 3. I've highlighted a bunch of these, and these are things that the student I'm going to need to think about how to help the student access these terms and understand them at a deeper level than just translating them into the home language. There are a couple other details, as well as this is a preposition, but it's right in front of the colossal noun phrase that we talked about before. And so understanding the meaning of this becomes a little bit more difficult than it might otherwise. Can be understood by, this is passive voice, which is also common in academic discourse. When we look at them all together, it's a lot. But for each one of these things, we could pull out a specific learning target. We can draw students' attention to them, thereby helping them build the skills they need to access these materials at a high level. No, that's not the only way you can do it. In Mehisto and Ting, they gave some really helpful lists of academic language in particular disciplines. In particular, they've got these appendices. They're online. They're not actually in the physical book, but they're online. For geography, history, math, and science. I've just I've put a screenshot up of a little bit of the history one, and you can see they have general characteristics about how the texts work, density, the use of abstract nouns, and then this is the nominalization, so the summarizing of events or activities in a single term, and so on. It also identifies related learning skills that are relevant for this discipline. There are actually several pages of material in different categories, and this I thought was one of the most useful resources in the book. Let's go back to terminology and let's talk about what one of these scaffolds for helping students learn this academic language might look like. And one that I want to go into some detail with is the idea of the concept map. A concept map can help students understand the relationships between terminology in a subject. So remember, we talked about how terminology, you need to have a broad conceptual understanding to even understand what one term is. Concept maps then actually mirror the cognitive architecture that we're trying to help students develop. And we know that having a clear cognitive architecture helps students file away new information and put it into their long-term memory. It's important also, as we make these concept maps, to connect them to how academic language is involved. So here's a bit of an example from the textbook excerpt that I showed a little bit ago. If our main concept is biomes, I'm looking to understand the what causes the distribution of different biomes around the world. So here, with this box here, I'm showing some of the academic language that I use to connect biomes to these three ideas: insolation, temperature, atmospheric circulation, and I have provided some glosses on a couple of these. But that's not all. We've got the tricellular model, and then we break that down even further. Now, one of the best things that we can do once we have this concept map is to take one term and relate it to another. So I might ask, after we've explored this concept map, I might ask the student, tell me about the tricellular model. And so I could guide the student, or the student could work towards being able to explain how the tricellular model helps us explain atmospheric circulation, which in turn helps us understand why biomes appear in different places on the Earth. Looking at concept maps, we can use them in a few different ways. The most basic way is to show a concept map during a lesson and use it as a visual aid in content teaching. Remember, we were talking about those academic narratives, and this is a great place to work on establishing those, using these concept maps to understand and explain the relationships. This particular concept map is one that I photographed in the book from geography, and something that I want to highlight is the way it used language along the arrows in order to build the relationships and show some of the academic language that students can use to discuss. Another way you can use a concept map is to give students a partially completed one, and work and ask them or work together with them to complete it. I'll show you also an example that I used recently in my own teaching. As I was reading the book, I thought, I'm going to try this, and here it went. So I was teaching in my English language and literature course, where I have a number of language learners. We were talking about literary essays, and we were talking about these concepts of Aldous Huxley's 3 poles of the essay. And I asked students to create their own concept maps. Now, the one that I've got over here is the one that I ultimately showed them as the way I think about essays, the way an essay moves from one pole to another, and then back again and around. It's a great way to visualize how essays are functioning. But asking students to make their own maps can reinforce learning. It gives creative engagement with content, and it's a useful way for the teacher to assess conceptual understanding. I'll just show you here on the next slide. These are some of the concept maps that my students created, and really different ways of thinking about these concepts that I found really fascinating, and the students seem to find useful. Everybody's was different. Anyway, this is an activity I definitely want to use again. Okay, language functions. Just a little bit about these. Students can learn specific language functions to use for different. They can learn specific language to use for specific functions, which they can then transfer between disciplines and contexts. There are a huge number of language functions, and I think this becomes a little bit overwhelming. This is where sorting out what language functions will be needed in the particular unit I'm teaching, that can be very helpful. Here are just a list of a number that might be relevant. How can we teach these? One way to do it is with handouts that contain example language. Here's one for comparing and contrasting. These lists can either be developed by looking at examples of strong student work from the past, or by looking at teacher-made exemplars and drawing out useful phrases. Here's a more detailed example. This is for the language function of developing a line of reasoning. And so you can see that there are different categories asking someone to elaborate, down to making a point of disagreement in different ways. There's one really core idea that we haven't addressed yet, and that is collaboration between teachers. There are, in CLIL and immersion settings, there are language teachers and there are content teachers. So how can these people interact most effectively? Mehisto and Ting argue that the work of supporting EAL students has to be school-wide. One teacher is not going to be able to do enough to make these academic experiences accessible for students. The best learning environments tend to have, number one, high expectations for content and learning, language learning for all students, and then a clearly focused and complementary content and language learning objectives. That is to say that there are specific language learning objectives that are paired with content learning objectives. And these are paired based on what language functions the students will need for that particular unit. Subject teachers also should be working to build their knowledge about language and should teach academic language explicitly in their classes. Language teachers then should work to embed their language lessons in content-rich experiences. In fact, one idea that I really liked about this was Mehisto and Ting suggested that language teachers should become familiar with what's going on in subject classes and use their lessons as enrichment opportunities to deepen the content learning about those subjects. There should be frequent collaboration between subject and language teachers so that everyone is aware of the content and language expectations and can coordinate the teaching of particular language elements. So, for example, the book talked about a content teacher saying, "Hey, I've got a lot of passive constructions coming up in this text that we're planning to use. Can you, the language teacher, help me in either how to teach that, or can you go back and review it with students?" Mehisto and Ting does recommend that language teachers are the primary ones focusing on grammatical structures, while content teachers are the primary teachers of terminology and vocabulary. Ultimately, though, everyone is teaching all of these elements. Okay, we have covered a lot. I may have lost myself in the weeds a little bit. Please forgive me. But I want to leave you with one more task. I'd like you to make a concept map. I've put together some concepts that we talked about today, and feel free to add others that you think are relevant. And I think it would be fantastic if you could create a concept map to help us all think about how we can be supporting EAL students. So here are your concepts to work with. Academic language, analysis of texts students will read and write during a content unit, language functions, terminology, collocations, collaboration, teaching content and language together, and different academic disciplines. I would love to see you arrange these in a concept map that is meaningful to you, and if you're feeling bold, post your concept map in the comment section on Schoology. I would love to see what you come up with. Final thoughts. This book has a lot to offer. It has these online appendices that I've already mentioned. It also goes into detail about scaffolding, assessment, and learning progressions. There's a strong theoretical grounding for all the claims made. I felt very well informed about why Mehisto and Ting were making the claims that they were. And it also looks into critical pedagogy, inquiry-based learning, intercultural competence, and other movements in education, not to mention having a number of practical ideas for a variety of academic subjects. Returning to our standards, I hope that you feel you have accessed some meaningful knowledge about these things that can lead to some additions to your own teaching. And I thank you so much for taking part today. My hope is that you've learned something meaningful. I absolutely feel that I have in the process of reading and actually of making the presentation. I feel I learned a lot more. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.